What's your favorite song?
What's your favorite song?
Okay, all right. Now, last week, or I should say Wednesday, kind of left off with verse 3. It says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. So then tonight, we are going to pick up from that thought and begin with verse 4. It says, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Now, a lot of times in the Bible, darkness is equated with evil. This is not to say at this point that God somehow separated good from evil. Because while the angelic realm had already been tainted by sin because of Satan's rebellion, in the physical universe that God has just now brought into existence, there is no sin. So don't read more into that passage than what's actually there.
That was just like the physical day and light and night kind of concept? Or?
Yeah, but we haven't quite got that far yet. At this point, God has created the earth. He's created the universe. The only reason I would say he created the universe is because in verse 1 it says he created the heavens and the earth. And in that context, the heavens he's talking about is the physical atmosphere of the earth and the sky, the outer space, as we would refer to it today. But at this point, God has yet to put anything in that universe except a formless earth. Basically, it's a planet that's, as far as we can tell from this passage, just water. Now, we can assume, and I'm sure geologists would, be interested in that sort of thing, is, well, did it have a molten core? Did it have iron? Did it have a mantle and all that stuff? I'm sure it probably did. But as far as the surface of the earth, from what we're told so far, it's a planet of water. And then God created light. Again, no sun, no moon, no stars yet, just the manifestation of God's light that has now permeated into the universe. But notice there in verse 4 it says the light was good and God separated the light from the darkness. If there is as yet no sun and no moon, how is it that God has separated light from darkness?
He's God. He can do what he wants.
Well, that's the easy answer.
Well, no, can I stop for just a minute? Because you said that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that would be the atmospheric. Isn't that outer space?
That includes outer space.
Well, doesn't outer space doesn't that include the sun and the
No,
moon?
it does not.
Okay.
I wouldn't.
Because those were specifically stated as being made in a
Because
Okay.
if you will look in, and I don't want to get into it, I'm just pointing this out just to answer your question. Let's see. What verse is that in?
That there be
Okay,
lights in the
verse
firmament.
14.
Yeah.
Says, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens. And if you continue reading on, it is not until verse 14 that God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars.
Okay.
At this point, there aren't any.
Okay. Right.
There's the heavens, or the universe, and God has created light. Now, if there is no sun, moon, and stars, and we discussed this on Wednesday, but just as a reminder, if there are no planetary or stellar bodies producing light, where's the light coming from?
From God.
From God.
God himself. And now it says that God has separated the light from the darkness. Notice it does not yet say that there's an evening or a morning or a day or night. It just says He separated the light from the darkness. So if there are no stellar bodies, no sun at this point, how is God doing this?
Focuses his light on them, something.
God, and along those lines, you figured that tells us right there, unlike what a lot of people used to believe hundreds of years ago, and believe it or not, there's still some people that claim to believe this in our society today, that we all know the earth's flat, right? Well, guess what? If God has separated the light from the darkness, that tells us the earth is not flat. Because if the earth is flat and there's light shining down on it, guess what? The whole thing's going to have light. God has created the light from the darkness, which that tells us now that indeed the earth is a sphere. It is a globe in space somewhere. And God, not to say that God is not everywhere. We know that God is everywhere. But God's Shekinah glory, God has allowed to focus on this newly formed planet Earth from one direction. Because if God is shining upon it from this direction, then what's over here on this side? Darkness. Darkness. So that tells us that God, as He is manifesting His Shekinah glory into this newly formed universe, is looking upon it from one direction, and that the earth is in fact a globe. Now, it is a possibility at this point, although I'm not sure that we can make this assumption yet. What produces an ongoing cycle of day and night in this planet today?
Rotation.
Rotation. It's possible that this may be God's, Moses and God's way of telling us that God has now started the planet rotating. Although I don't think we can yet make that assumption, because the planet could still just be sitting there and it would still be light on one side and dark on the other, correct?
Yeah.
So, however, by verse 5, it is very clear that God has now started this newly formed planet rotating. If it didn't start in verse 4, it definitely did by verse 5. Because look, verse 5, it says, "And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening and there was morning one day." By the way, if you're reading from the King James or some of the others, it'll say the first day. That is actually not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew literally says day one. And in the second day of creation, it says day 2.
Okay, what's the significance?
That it
One's
went from
cardinal
evening-
number, one's an ordinal number, but is there a significance?
Not really, but to say that it's the first day does add something to it that's really not there in the original Hebrew. It basically just says day number 1. Which again, and the reason I point that out is because remember on Wednesday we talked about the gap theory? A lot of the folks that adhere to the gap theory and think that that is what happened, they use that statement as evidence because that actually would add some weight to it, the difference between being the first day versus just simply being day number 1. Because if it is indeed the first day, then there can't have been any days prior to that. But in this case, it just says day number 1. Now, again, I personally don't see the evidence there in the original Hebrew to support the belief in the gap theory. But there is some that's there, and we just need to realize, as Larry, mentioned last week when he was reading from the commentary notes in his own Bible, there's a lot of people out there that do believe in the gap theory, and that's one of the things that adds a little bit more evidence to that. All right, now, but the fact that we have evening and morning, what else does that prove to us?
It had to be a sun.
Rotation.
Yeah, what Lou said, that tells us God has now started the earth rotating.
That would make it day one because of the rotation.
Uh-huh. Because if the earth weren't rotating, you might have day on one side and night on the other, but you can't have a morning and an evening or anything like that. It's just day and night, period. Just like in the moon. How many of you realize, I know a lot of folks don't think that the moon does. How many of you are aware of the fact that the moon does in fact rotate?
Yeah. It goes around the earth at one rotation.
No, that's a revolution.
Well, one rotate, but it rotates. One
But it also,
revolution.
how many of you know, when the moon goes around the earth, that's a revolution. Just like the earth going around the sun. We have one revolution per year. How many of you are aware of the fact that the moon also rotates?
One rotation.
Lou, how many times does it rotate?
One rotation per one revolution.
There you go. One rotation every 28 days.
Wow.
Imagine if my left fist here is the earth. If the moon, with my finger here, did not rotate, what you would see is this. But as it is, we know that when we look up at the moon, we see the same side of the moon every single day, don't we? As the moon turns, it keeps that same side toward the earth, which means the moon is actually rotating one time for every month it goes around. Again, if it stayed the same, like my little Dr. Pepper bottle, imagine if Dr. Pepper's the face of it, it would do this, and as it goes around, you'd see the whole thing. But one rotation means it does that and keeps the same side, the same face toward the planet at all times. That's the reason there's no such thing as the light and dark side of the moon.
There's no dark side of the moon.
Yeah, there is no dark side of the moon, because when we see a new moon from our perspective, what we a lot of times call the dark side of the moon is actually, that's the side facing the sun that's now very much in the light. It's the near and far side, not the light and the dark side. So even the moon does rotate. It's just very slowly, one time a month. So anyway, back to this passage of Scripture. It says that now clearly God has begun the earth rotating, and says there was evening and morning, the first day or one day. Now, there's another thing. I mentioned this on Wednesday, but in case you've forgotten, I want to remind you of this. Notice the order that Moses wrote this. He didn't say, as we do in our culture, day and night. Like for us, of course, we know calendar-wise, we consider the day beginning at midnight. But as far as like the work day, when do we consider the work day beginning?
In the morning.
In the morning when the sun comes up.
Yeah.
Jews do not and did not and never have. Because based on this, notice it says not morning and evening or day and evening, it's evening and morning. The evening comes first, which is why in the Jewish calendar, each day begins with sundown. So for them, and that's the reason you see, like in the crucifixion account, this is one of the reasons why this is so important for us. You may think, well, that's just difference in calendar. No, there's a lot of theological importance in that. Why do you think they were in such a rush to get Jesus' body off the cross?
Evening of the Sabbath.
Because the evening was coming, and when the sun hit the horizon, the Sabbath began. And it was within an hour of the sun going down, and they knew Jesus' body, or the body of anybody, could not be on a cross on the Sabbath day. They were in a rush to get him and those two thieves off the cross and out of there. Jesus, of course, had already done what he needed to do. The two thieves, on the other hand, they were still very much alive, which is why the Roman guards were told, break their legs. Now, their last 3 or 4 minutes in this life would have been excruciating, because they would have had their legs broken and had been hanging there and not able to push up. Because when you're hanging on a cross and you can't push up, you can't breathe. So they would have spent their last 3 or 4 minutes in this life in excruciating pain, suffocating. And it was all in order to get their bodies off the cross before the Sabbath day started.
Playing right into God's hands.
They had God right where they wanted him.
Well, yeah, but I went the wrong way, I guess.
Yeah. All right. So, that's the first day. So as you can see, on the first day of creation, we'll see if we can tackle the second day tonight. On the first day of creation, God brought a universe into existence and a formless planet, and he brought light into existence. 3 things necessary for physical life to begin. Then, the second day, verse 6, it says, "Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day." Again, a whole day of creation that it would seem God didn't really do that much. Now, this expanse he's talking about, this is the current atmosphere. Now, you may recall that we already saw at the very beginning that God created the heavens and the earth. That's primarily talking about outer space. And the Bible also refers to the atmosphere right around us that we're breathing here as the first heaven. There's no indication here at this point that God didn't create air at that point. He may or may not have. But if he didn't, he definitely created the air that we breathe by the second day. But what's really important and what we can see here is it says he separated the waters from the waters. And this is important to remember. Do not think laterally, think vertically. Because what this is talking about here is unlike our planet today. What was the atmosphere of this planet was a massive amount of water vapor. You had the water that constituted the oceans, and there was a mass of water vapor in what we now call our atmosphere. And when it says that God created an expanse separating the waters from the waters, it's not saying he separated the waters this way. It's saying God separated the waters this way. You have the ocean and the waters of the planet, the surface of the planet here, and apparently in the high up in the atmosphere, there was a large, massive amount of water vapor above or at the very upper layers of the atmosphere. And then the breathable atmosphere in the middle. Now, how do we know this? Look at verse 7. It says, God made the expanse, separated the waters which were below, not to the left or right or north or south, which were below the expanse, from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called this expanse heaven. In other words, that's why the Bible refers to this as the first heaven. As you leave the surface of the earth and go upward, that expanse is the first thing you go through. What we today call our atmosphere. The Bible refers to that as the first heaven. Now, it says evening and there was morning, a second day. Now, this might be as far as we get. We got 10 minutes left, but this is worth some talking about here. You may wonder, okay, so there's waters above and waters below. Why is that so important? When God sent the flood in Genesis chapter 6, we're told that there was water coming up from below, that there's springs of water just popped up. And by the way, archaeologists and geologists today are in agreement that there is massive amounts of evidence within the crust of the earth to indicate the possibility that at some point in the past, now of course they say millions of years. I say probably about 6,000, and I think that's what the Bible supports. But that at whatever point in the past, that there was a massive underground ocean below the surface of the planet. Also, at the same time that Genesis chapter 6 tells us that all this water started coming up, what happened and did for 40 days and 40 nights?
It rained.
It rained. Guess where that rain came from? This expanse that was above the atmosphere. That's where all this water came from. Below and above. And it was a massive amount of water. Obviously enough to flood the entire surface of the planet. Now, we know there was already enough water to flood the entire planet because on day one of creation, what did the planet consist of?
Water.
Nothing but water. So the planet Earth started out flooded until God created land, which we'll get to, I believe, on day 3. So it started out with a flood, but back to this firmament above. Why do you think God put so much water in the upper atmosphere?
We had to have something to grow the plants, or right? I mean,
We're doing that now, and there's no firmament or anything up above the atmosphere today. We got clouds in the sky, but that's just plain old water vapor.
Balance.
What's that?
Balance.
Well,
So there'd be enough for the flood when it happened?
there you go.
well, there was, but
Protect us from the radiation.
all right, now you're on the right track.
Teacher's pet.
Meryl isn't here.
Meryl isn't here. I was thinking the very same thing.
Meryl would be sitting here snickering about this time.
You've been all over right away.
All right, Karen, did no? Okay. For a second, I thought you had a flash.
I was like, yeah, I get it.
Okay. Consider this. What happens, I mean, for all of us who grew up here in Florida, what is just about every native Floridian when we were kids and running around, with barefooted, no shirt on, no hat on? What are half the people in this state and a lot of places like, in the South where you're exposed to heavy sun, what do you deal with when you get old?
Skin cancer.
Skin cancer. What's that cause from?
Radiation.
Exposure to ultraviolet radiation. Guess what ultraviolet radiation can't penetrate?
Water.
That's right. It doesn't go through water vapor. It can't.
Okay.
Well, okay, so you're saying it can't go through water vapor, because I know I got burnt pretty regular when I was swimming.
Yeah, that was from the time you were above the water, not in the water. Because how much time when you were swimming did you spend outside the pool?
Oh, I don't know. I was drenched in copper tone like half the people in the room.
And as soon as you jumped in the water, all that copper tone went floating out. And then you got out and spent half hour, an hour in the sun, sunning yourself.
Yep.
Anyway, back to the point here. Before the flood, how long did people live?
Hundreds of years.
Uh-huh. Even after the fall, the average lifespan of humanity was about 900 plus years. Animals lived massive lifespans. Why? Because there was nothing in the atmosphere, nothing in our environment that caused people to age that quick. As soon as, I realize we're going to cover all this stuff again when we get to those chapters, so I'm just going to kind of skate over it now. But early on, as soon as the flood was over with, now of course we know Noah was already about 600 years old, but With each generation after that, what did you notice about the lifespans of humanity with every generation after the flood?
Got shorter and shorter.
It got shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter because of the change in the atmosphere and in the environment. Because now there is no longer that protective layer of water vapor. We've got vapor in the atmosphere, which of course is how, God sends rains now. But think not just the clouds you see, but consider back then at the very upper parts of the atmosphere, there was massive amounts of water vapor. And that served as a filter to keep the, not sunlight, but the dangerous rays, gamma radiation, ultraviolet radiation, cosmic radiation, all those things that are dangerous to us, all that stuff would have gotten filtered out. And so you'd have had a planet that would have received all of the life-giving sunlight and radiation from the sun, but none of the life-altering or dangerous types of radiation. Wouldn't have happened until the flood. And then that changed everything. Also, there's one additional thing that would have done. You talk about the global warming alarmists all talk about producing a greenhouse effect.
That's what we've been.
Yeah. Folks, you ain't seen nothing. Imagine it wouldn't have been a sauna, but it would have been a worldwide paradise as far, I don't mean paradise in the sense of the Garden of Eden. Yes, God ran Adam and Eve out. He said, guess what? You're going to have thorns and some other things to deal with. But the climate would have been a worldwide paradise. There would, the farther north, or when you get in the southern hemisphere, the farther toward the South Pole, what happens?
It's cold, but
It gets cold.
they're not there.
And to the point that when you get above, beyond the Arctic or Antarctic circles, life is near about impossible there without special equipment. They wouldn't have existed then. It would have been a worldwide greenhouse. You could have gone anywhere on the planet that you wanted to, and the climate would have been great.
Pretty much like it will be after the new Earth, not the new Earth, but
Mhm.
the Millennium Earth.
Absolutely.
So 75 and always sunny.
Pretty much. Also, the Bible, we haven't gotten that far yet. We'll see that again in chapter 6. But before the flood, it had never even rained. When Noah told everybody it was going to rain, not only would they laughed at him because, they didn't believe him, but it had never rained before.
Okay.
When Noah's talk about it was going to do something that it had never done before, they're thinking, you're an idiot.
Yeah. The sky is falling.
All right.
Sky
The
is
Bible
falling.
actually tells us, and we'll get to that point shortly, the Bible tells us that prior to the flood, God watered the surface of the planet by morning dew. That the atmosphere had enough water vapor in it that every day there would be enough dew on the surface of the planet to basically keep everything well watered without rain. So all you ladies that don't like getting into a high humid area because it messes up your hair, guess what?
Hair would have been nice all the time.
Would have been quite humid most of the time.
Most of the time, but nice.
But it wouldn't have been a sweaty humid because the temperature would have been perfect.
Yeah.